Hello, and thank you very much for joining me to talk about the use of data, and in particular looking at whether it's ethical in real estate. And what I'd like to do for the next 20 minutes or so is talk about the growing influence of data generally, to set a bit of a backdrop, and then to look at data ethics, what it is, and to put it into a real estate context. And then finally, just to look at what do we do about it, or what are some of the things that we can do next. And it's very well documented that the growth of data in the world is incredible and exponential. And there's an often said phrase, which is that 90% of all of the data in the world has been created in the last 2 years alone. I think it's worth just reflecting on that and trying to visualize what that actually means. So if we put a circle up representing all of the data, the area representing all of the data ever collected from the start of time up to 2015, it would look something like that. And if we then compare it to the subsequent 2 years, then we can see that in 16 and 17, there's an absolute deluge of data that we now have access to. We then follow that on for the subsequent 2 years, we can see that again, the growth is exponential. And it's against this backdrop that we're getting huge amounts of data that we're able to inform our decisions. So why is this? Well, in large part, it's because we're starting to collect data from everything that we use. So whether it's CCTV or mobile devices that are shown there, or the sensors that we're putting on in our buildings to make sure that we can collect things, there's an opportunity for everything to now collect data, which is why we're getting it. And in real estate, the other thing about not only collecting data, but storing it is that we're seeing that we're using data sets across the built life cycle in a very different way. So historically, the stages of the life cycle that are represented on that graph are increasingly used in collecting data. Now, what hasn't happened in the past is that that data then gets shared. And we're seeing a real trend of the data sets that are being collected at every stage of the life cycle, increasingly flowing across the whole building. Arguably, this is a good example of the point of building information modeling, or BIM. And so as a sector, we're starting to find that we have huge amounts more volume of data being collected today, and also we're getting better at storing the data from the past. So how does this affect real estate, and why is it important? Well, if we look at where we are today, and we look at when we set our standards, most of the standards say that we ought to be using the data that's available in the market already and that people are using. And if we look at that, when the standards were set and where we are today would typically be the traditional data sets. So for example, rents, size, yields, and so on. And we haven't really changed dramatically or moved on. But we've just seen in the previous few slides, we're at the early stages of an exponential growth of data being collected. Everything is now collecting data that's available for us to support decision making. We've also seen we're getting better at storing data. So historical data that has not been accessible in the past is now becoming much easier for us to inform decisions later on. And then finally, there's also a huge amount of inferred data or synthesized data that we can start using to inform those decisions. So real estate is used to using the traditional data sets, but we're at the very start and the early stages of an exponential growth of the amount of data that's being collected, that's available from the past, and that can be used as an alternative. So as a sector, we're going to have to really use this data to inform decision making. Now, real estate decisions are starting to change. It's less about cost and space. It's more about the impact on people. So for example, things like happiness, well-being, productivity are all becoming more important deciding factors in especially the office sector. Now, these are very difficult to measure, but the good news is we're getting more and more data. So we can use those data sets to understand those implications and make better decisions. So it's very easy to get to the conclusion that we should collect all the data that we can get our hands on, and we use it to get maximum insight as long as it's within the law. And I think that's a very defendable situation. But what I want to ask and challenge going forward is that the right approach? I want to start off by talking about ethics and start with a very simple explanation. So moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. And I think at the heart of all of this, it comes down to trust. And we can look at three different things which are absolutely interrelated, but they are separate and often get treated in the same way. So firstly, we've got the technological things that we can do with data. Can I collect it? What's possible? And this is very much the how. Secondly, there's the legal aspects. What am I allowed to do in law? And both of these are relatively black and white. If you can collect it, you can collect it. If you can't, you can't. Legal is less black and white, but is often a huge amount of effort is put into making sure it's a relatively clear-cut situation. The third area that I want to talk about overlaps with those, but is different. And this is very much about whether we should be using it. And the problem with ethics is this is a very much more subjective question. And why does it matter? Well, here's an example from the British Property Federation of a survey that looked at the sentiment about real estate. And you can see that the real estate sector generally in the general public is relatively neutral, the perception of it. And we've seen the challenge of sectors and companies with their trust when they have problems with the data. So this is an example from Facebook, and you can see that over around 7 years, they built up from 67% to 79% positive trust. And then just within 1 week of Cambridge Analytica problems, it dropped down to 27%. So it takes a long time to build up the reputation that you've got, and very quick to lose that if you don't use data correctly. And just to drive this point home, a company over in the UK called Grosvenor, which is a large property owner and developer, carried out the largest ever canvassing of public trust in large-scale developments in the UK. And when it comes to planning for large-scale development, of the public sector, only 2% trusted this sector. And I think that's a massive challenge that we're going to have to face and address. And if we don't include data ethics and the trust around data in that, we're going to really struggle and fail to achieve that. And not only is it a problem, data ethics, but we're also seeing that people are aware of it. So a survey here by RICS was carried out recently, and it showed of all the problems and challenges we face from data, that the privacy and data ethics is the largest challenge. And we're seeing examples of where this is causing problems in business, whether it's use of facial recognition, GDPR fines because of holding on to data, or challenges with public perception in large-scale developments. So I want to go into look at a few different aspects. And the first thing is, what data do we collect? And if we accept that the premise that the future value of office is going to be determined by employee well-being and productivity, as we've seen earlier, we should be collecting that data to really inform those decisions. So what data can we collect? Well, we can use things like image recognition to understand who's in the building, where they are, what their mood is and how they're feeling, what they're carrying, and so on. At the moment, against the backdrop of COVID-19, we're seeing an awful lot of focus on measuring temperatures. So we can measure the temperature of people coming in. We can use technology to understand who's typing at what time and how productive they're being when they're taking breaks on their technology. Or we could use wearable technology to understand the health and well-being of people. For example, understanding their heart rate. It's very easy, I think, to make a case that all of these individual data sets could be combined to help us better understand the performance of the building. But the question here is, should we be collecting this, and how do we communicate it to the people we're collecting it about? This also exaggerates the problem that we've got about timing and subjectivity. For me, I don't really want to be measured on all these things in a building that I would typically go to. But it's also, perhaps against COVID-19, something that I would accept more readily now than I would have done 6 months ago. So the second thing I want to look at is the data sets that we use, that we're given. How do we trust those? And for this, I want to use an example of this town layout that you can see in front, the grey being the buildings, white being the roads between them, and then the green there, you've got a park between buildings 1 and 2. And any decision making that we make about buildings uses significant numbers of different data sets. But for the point of this, I just want to pick on a small number of those and use those specific examples. And the first one I want to talk about is traffic data. So traffic data can be used to inform a decision in 2 different ways. Firstly, especially if it's something like a logistics building, access and traffic getting to a building is incredibly important. So you don't want to be in a space with lots of traffic. You want to be on the greener side where it's easier to get to. The other thing that traffic data can be good for is it can be used as a proxy. So typically where you've got traffic, you're going to have noise pollution or air pollution. So I think in both cases, if you would agree that we would choose building number 2 if it was only the traffic data that we were using. And where can we get that traffic data? Well, there are a number of different sources, but a best one that we can use as an example is Google Maps. And Google Maps is something that has live traffic information on almost every street around the world, and is a great source of information. But how do we trust that that data is correct? You may have seen that last year, a performance artist carried around a trolley that you can see on the screen of around 100 mobile devices, and it showed empty streets being showed up as busy at the time. So the data was being manipulated or gamed, in this case for the purpose of art, but why not use it for other reasons if it's becoming more and more important in decision making? Another example we could use is looking at supply and demand. And we could look at demand, for example, here, and understand that the building on number 2 looks as though it's going to be a better proposition based entirely on this one graph. So where can we get those data sources? Well, we can look at things like Google, what are people searching for? Here you can see that we might start looking at trends and demand for a building. And if you look at the top of the screen, we have an example of what's being searched for in a popular search engine in terms of co-working spaces. So this is looking at co-working spaces in 3 different cities. And we can see the one at the top, which I think was Paris, has got more demand than in others. Now, again, you wouldn't use this alone as the driver for demand, but because there's no incentive to change these results, then we can count on them as being relatively fair and accurate. As soon as this gets used to inform decision-making, we then have to question whether it's a trustable data set. Another example would be planning permissions. So we often use planning applications to understand both what's happening in an area, but particularly what's going to happen in the future. So here you can see a number of different, probably unattractive applications on the left-hand side and more attractive ones on the right. But again, how do we understand that these are being put in not to inform the decision and skew people's view of an area, but because they're actual genuine applications? So again, the trust of the data is a real challenge. And then one final example is the use of research reports. Now, we often use research reports as background context and to inform the decisions that we're making. So here I've got one by Professor Ashkán Zandieh of the University of North East England and another by Dr. Rourke Canmore from the River Institute. And you can see, based entirely on these 2 reports, you'd probably be looking to invest in Eastern Europe, in Budapest and Warsaw, and in the industrial sector. Now, whilst we wouldn't base any investment decisions purely on 2 reports, we do read these and it informs our decision making. And the question here is, how much of this can we trust? And the answer is not that much. So the quotes in there are made up entirely for the purpose of this presentation. And in fact, the reports themselves are not even real. They were made up very, very quickly in a piece of software that helps create professional-looking reports in a matter of minutes. The University of North East England and the River Institute don't exist. They were both created in random name generators, and then the logos were created in a piece of software that creates logos, again, in a matter of seconds. You probably won't be surprised now to know that Professor Ashkán Zandieh and Dr. Rourke Canmore don't exist either. These were created in random name generators. And possibly most starkly of all, those people don't exist. In fact, they aren't even real people. These are images created in artificial intelligence of people that don't even exist. So what starts off looking like quite credible background information to inform our decision making quite quickly falls down into something that we can't trust at all. So we've looked at the data that we can collect and whether it's ethical. We need to consider the data that we use, that we get from outside sources, understanding whether it's ethical and whether it's trusted. Another example I want to look at is how we then use the data. So for this, I want to use a reputed example from Uber of a software application called Grable. And this software application used a number of different techniques, such as geofencing, looking at credit card databases, identifying the devices that were being used, social media, and so on, to help them understand how to protect their business. So looking for people who weren't likely to pay or caused potential problems to their drivers. And a couple of years ago, some whistleblowers came out and said that allegedly Uber were using this to avoid regulators. So they're using the very same software and data to start using it for a different application. And I think this is an excellent example of using the same data sets, the same software, for what most people would regard as an ethical purpose, to protect your business, in this case, the drivers, And alternatively, to use the same data, the same software, but for what most people I think would count as unethical purposes, in this case, avoiding regulators. So it isn't just about the data itself, it's about the software and how you use it. So lastly, I want to look at how we present the information. And for this purpose, I want to use the slide here with 3 data sets about house prices in the UK. And this is 3 of the 15 or so regions that are reported by the UK government. And you can see that very broad brush, the northeast of England has stayed pretty flat. The east of England has gone higher and accelerated more than any of the others. And London is probably the lowest prices and has gone on quite a decline. Now, the challenge with this data, and what we need to really challenge ourselves on in ethics, is how we avoid telling a story that we want to tell. If we then look at the data sets in their raw format against each other, you can see that actually, whilst the northeast has remained flat, it's very, very low. East is not the highest by any stretch and has gone up in a fairly modest way. And London has had a small dip, but overall has significantly gone up. And the challenge of this is that we can show real data, real analysis, but tell a very different story depending on what we want to say. So for the real estate sector, trust and ethics is already a large challenge. And as we go into a more data-driven world, it's going to become more and more important. It's going to be important looking at the data that we collect and use ourselves, where we get it from elsewhere, how do we make sure that's ethical and trusted, the way that we apply the data and software to the actual purpose, and then finally how we present that to people moving forward. So there are a lot of challenges. And unfortunately, these are going to be very complicated questions that change depending on the time, the data sets, the use, the people, the building, and so on. So identifying what is black and white and what is right and wrong is going to be tricky. But what we can do is start using some high-level principles to guide our thinking. And this is something that the real estate sector really needs to get on board with as soon as possible. So for example, I'm involved with an organization called the Real Estate Data Foundation, which has got 6 data ethical principles that we're asking people to support. There's more details on the website, which you can see on screen, but in short, these are about being accountable for the data that you collect and that you use, making sure that you're transparent about it, and making sure that use is proportionate to what you're trying to get out of it. You need to be confidential and private. Of course, you need to be lawful and work within the laws that are around. And finally, you need to make sure it's secure. So those are 6 principles that can inform all of your thinking about when you're using data and how you use it to make sure that you're on the path with being ethical. So how can you help? There are 2 things I would love for everyone watching this to do. Firstly, get involved and join the LinkedIn group for the Real Estate Data Foundation. There's a conversation going on of data experts across all corners of the real estate sector about data, and it's an opportunity to share insights and ask questions. Secondly, I would encourage everyone to work towards the data ethical principles that are shown on the screen and to encourage others to do so. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I think data ethics is the biggest challenge that we're going to face in the coming decades. And as a sector, for very low cost and low effort, we can get on the front foot with addressing it now, and I would encourage you to do so. Thank you very much indeed for listening.